you, Gideon, for joining us from Berlin for this really very special talk. We're happy to have you with us and look forward to an interesting and substantial lecture. All of us who are tuning in are alert to the fact that anti-Semitism has been on the rise over the last couple of decades. It waxes and wanes over time, but we're in a period now when it's certainly been on the rise and on a global basis. We do our best in this series to look at such hatred as it appears in various countries, and Germany is one of the most important to cover in this regard for reasons that will become clear in just a moment as our lecturer presents his talk. Gideon Botsch is at the University of Potsdam, connected to the Moses Mendelssohn Center in particular. He teaches courses there and actively pursues research on anti-Semitism and right-wing extremism, something he's been doing for roughly the last quarter of a century in an important way. He lectures frequently, he publishes a great deal on these subjects. He's been connected to the Wannsee Conference House and Education site in the past. He's also taught in the past at Germany's Free University in Berlin, and if I have it right, still teaches from time to time at Turo College in Berlin. So we really have the privilege of our being joined by a very experienced, very devoted, very knowledgeable scholar of this subject. The emphasis today is going to be squarely on the right wing in Germany. Next week, we're going to be focusing on left-wing anti-Semitism with Linda Meisels, and the right and the left hardly exhaust the sources from which such hatred, in fact, today appears. But today it's on right-wing extremism and anti-Semitism in Germany, and we couldn't ask for a better person, a more qualified person to address it than our speaker now.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Erwin Rosenfeld and Günter Jäckeli, for the warm introduction and for inviting me to this webinar series, which I follow for quite a time, and which has brought very interesting lectures up to that point. And I feel a little bit honored that I can take part in it today. With my topic for today, current developments of anti-Semitism in Germany's far right. In an interview, His Excellency Mr. Ron Prosser, the new Israeli ambassador in Berlin, stated recently that the public in Germany should put more attention on anti-Semitism from the left than on anti-Semitism from the right, as a conclusion from last summer's debate around the Documenta Art Fair in Kassel. I do not agree with the ambassador on this question. First, because I'm skeptic if anti-Semitism of the type which came up around the Documenta debate can really be limited to the political left, at least in Germany. The Documenta debate was, at least in our public here, obviously a mainstream and partly elite discourse, not just a radical left one. To be honest, I think that this is much more worrying than a campaign from a fringe group. But this is only one aspect, the widespread idea that we know enough about the far right's anti-Semitism, that we don't have to talk so much about it because it's not that important and dangerous any more than other forms, is not accurate from my point of view and from my own work with a focus on the far right in Germany. The following can be concluded. The political far right is in this country still the most devoted, active, and dangerous political actor in propagating anti-Jewish hatred and carrying out anti-Semitic actions. It's not the only one, but I would say it's still the most active one. B, there's only limited empirical research on the far right's anti-Semitism in Germany. With some exceptions, like my colleagues Lars Riensmann or Samuel Salzborn, social and political scientists in Germany work either on anti-Semitism, with a tendency to ignore or underestimate far-right manifestations, or on the far right, with a tendency to ignore or underestimate anti-Semitism as one of its main features. This leads to limited knowledge about dynamics, changes, and developments in the field of far-right anti-Semitism. So It's not only my profession, but it's also that I truly believe that we should put more attention on it than we did recently. And C, the public and scientific preoccupation with left Islamist or mainstream anti-Semitism leads furthermore to a certain blindness for the impact of far-right anti-Semitism on a broader public. Maybe we will have the chance to discuss this later. Since more than 2 years, we had to witness the largest and most important public manifestations of anti-Semitism in the history of post-war Germany, at least since the 1960s. Most of those manifestations on the streets, in the parliament, in the media, on the internet, and in the form of physical or even terrorist violence, most of those have to be categorized as right-wing ultra-nationalist. You may remember the attempted massacre inside the synagogue of Halle on Yom Kippur 2019 by a terrorist lone actor clearly motivated by far-right ideologies. Already a year before, in 2018, when a mob of thousands of enraged neo-Nazis, hooligans, and adherents of the party Alternative für Deutschland, AfD, rallied in Chemnitz, a Jewish Israeli restaurant in the inner city was attacked by an organized troop of neo-Nazi activists who threw stones at the place and destroyed its windows. And the killer of Walter Lübcke, a local politician in Hesse, in the summer of 2019, this killer was a convicted anti-Semite with a long record of neo-Nazi activities, including brutal acts of violence. This was all topped in summer 2020. After several street protests, ever growing in numbers, against state measures for the containment of the COVID-19 pandemics, on a weekend at the end of August, protesters called for a major event in the capital, Berlin. The official call was accompanied by rumors in Telegram and other messenger services that great things are to be expected, maybe even the Tag X, the D-Day on which the resistance movement will finally overthrow the government. It was the very day when the stairs of the Reichstag, the German parliament, had been stormed, and you may remember the pictures of this event. But even before, on that day, from the morning on, tens of thousands gathered in the city center around Friedrichstraße, Brandenburger Tor, and Siegessäule. I attended this march together with a colleague to get an own impression and talked afterwards with many journalists and other critical onlookers. While not all participants shared anti-Semitic views personally, the formative impression the rally gave was anti-Jewish. The event was frequented by numerous adherents and activists from the whole spectrum of the far right, able to show off their symbols and slogans openly without noteworthy dissociation by other participants or the organizers. The flag of the old German Reich, the black, white, and red tricolor, was the symbol of the day. We also spotted numerous participants wearing openly neo-Nazi symbols or symbols referring to the far-right anti-Semitic QAnon movement. Self-written signs read, "Excuse me now for the language, but it's a quote, NWO," with the letters NWO referring to the anti-Semitic code New World Order. In later demonstrations related to COVID-19, other codes, or to the pandemics, other codes and symbols have been used. Then participants of the marches pinned, for example, yellow stars to the jackets, thus comparing the preventive measures meant to save lives with a mass murder in the Shoah. While the protests around the COVID topic are very small by now, anti-Semitism from the right is still a worrying issue. It is, for example, present in the campaigns against climate policy. There is a narrative of a hidden plan behind green policies. I don't know if it exists in the same way in the United States, but at least in Germany, there is this narrative. Green politics, which are in this phantasma and paranoid myth, aimed to introduce socialism and a new world order by implementing measures to stop the global warming. This specific, clearly anti-Semitic myth of a world domination originates in the far right, but it is worrying that anti-Semitic codes and buzzwords have been adopted in some cases by elite groups close to the carbon industry, like the financially strong lobby group Initiative Neue Soziale Marktwirtschaft, and also have been adopted by some individual politicians from democratic center-right parties. We should keep in mind that all mentioned manifestations of anti-Jewish hatred can occur in combination with Israel-related anti-Semitism, and often do so. Now I like to share my screen with you for a second. I hope that will work. We tested it, but sometimes it doesn't work. Now, just a second. Sorry for a moment. Günther, do we see the?
We see the blue circle.
Blue image. Okay. After this impressions from Germany. Oh, sorry. Now I have a problem. Okay. Okay. Just a second. Need another. Sorry. After this short impressions from Germany, I wanted to go to my main topic, to the far right in Germany at the moment. And what I wanted to tell you is that it underwent in the last decade serious changes, even in a way of a formation of a new far right movement in Germany. And this far right movement has is built up of four fields of action or segments. We have to look at party politics and parliamentary politics on one side, or as one pillar of this movement, on activities in the media, including new social media, street protests, and on the field of violence and terrorism, as I try to show in this image here. Those are the four segments of this new movement, and I want to stress a little bit. And you don't need to see the image anymore. I just wanted to show you what I'm talking about. I want to go a little bit deeper into the development of this movement. Okay, I stop the shared screen. And go back to my manuscript. The far right underwent in the last 10 years substantial changes and regroupings, and this dynamic development is still going on with surprising effects year by year. It started off from approximately 2012, 2013. We have been confronted since then with new players, action forms, and topics in these four segments I just showed to you. The actors active in those four sectors are interconnected with each other. They have ties and overlaps, but they are not identical. We see discrepancies about ideological aspects, strategies and tactics, competition and turf fights, and as always with Germany's far right, simply personal dislikes and vanities. In the first decade of the new millennium, before the formation of this new movement, the far right was dominated by and large by the traditional old right party NPD, which is still existing. The NPD was founded already in the 1960s, and from 2000 on, it became more and more an openly neo-Nazi party. Racial anti-Semitism and National Socialist tradition was embraced by the NPD. Up to a certain point, the party was quite successful, with factions in 2 parliaments in Eastern German federal states. I am convinced that the NPD's campaigns helped a lot to spread and normalize far-right, racist, and anti-Semitic narratives in that time. In a certain way, the AfD later on harvested a field which was already tilled by the NPD. Closely connected with the NPD, neo-Nazi gangs committed acts of brutal violence. In fact, they still do. The NSU terror cell, with NSU standing for National Socialist Underground, is the most prominent example. It is not really comprehended by large parts of the public, that is at least my impression. It is not really comprehended that the ideology behind the racist executions and bomb attacks of the NSU can only be understood against the background of underlying anti-Semitism. The second important network on the far right was the so-called New Right, centered around the weekly newspaper Junge Freiheit, or the Institut für Staatspolitik, and built up by an archipelago of smaller publishing houses and institutions and so on. The New Right campaigned in this period of time, in the first decade of the new millennium, around the same topics as the traditionalist NPD and neo-Nazis. Immigration was denounced as a plot against the German people, a plot leading to a civil war with immigrants as the ground troops of the invaders, but with a globalist elite in the background. Does this sound familiar? Correct, it is the century-old myth of the Jewish world conspiracy. And that it is becomes even more obvious when we draw our attention to the second main topic for the New Right German history. The so-called New Right intellectuals in Germany not openly deny the Holocaust, even though they are downplaying it. Their main argument is that the culture of remembrance has become a negative counter-religion, aimed by the same globalist anti-German elite groups, aimed to break the identity of the German people. The far-right myth of an Holocaust cult or Holocaust religion is, in fact, closely connected to Christian traditionalist narratives. Here, the official institutional churches and church hierarchies are pictured as elements of apostasy. In the particular case of the Roman Catholics, the narrative, told, for example, by the Society of St. Pius X, is part of the resistance against the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s. The Second Vatican Council, which helped the Church to overcome at least some of its anti-Jewish traditions, as I may remind you if you allow. Another side note is necessary at this point. The narrative of an Holocaust cult illustrates the greater impact of far-right anti-Semitism, reaching way beyond its core right-wing constituency. As you may have already noticed, part of the wording sounds familiar from current mainstream debates on the singularity of the Shoah and the blaming of Holocaust remembrance as a religious cult. It is one of many examples how far-right catchwords can migrate into mainstream language. But let's get back to the far-right itself. However influential the New Right may have been or have not been in the first decade of the millennium, in the political field, it was not able to gain momentum. It needed windows of opportunity and it needed tailwinds from the mainstream. From 2010 to 2012, a process started off which led to a fundamental reshaping of the far right. Since then, the New Right learned about new ways to address a wider public in the age of new social media. Success seemed to be possible, seemed to be at reach, like the editor-in-chief of the New Right weekly Junge Freiheit wrote in 2009. This time, I'm optimistic. Quote, end quote. While the NSU scandal of 2011 shocked the public, important neo-Nazi groups had been banned, and the NPD suffered from serious setbacks. Thus, traditional far-right organizations and networks had also, as well as the New Right, had also to think about their future strategies. So the situation changed around 2012 and 2013 drastically. In 2012, the first actions of groupings of the identitarian movement, took place in Austria and Germany. Its members came, in many cases, directly from the neo-Nazi camp, with the influential organizer Martin Sellner from Vienna as the most prominent example. The same year, Die Rechte, a party now dissolved, a new neo-Nazi party was founded, soon to be followed in 2013 by the hardcore National Socialist group Der Dritte Weg. Both minor, or the Third Path, or something like that, both minor parties use aggressive anti-Semitic slogans. For example, the scandalous campaign poster, Israel is our misfortune, of Die Rechte. In 2013, the new populist right party AfD was founded. From the start off, it attracted far-right activists and voters, and opinion polls show that the percentage of anti-Semites amongst its constituency is significantly higher than in any other German party except for the NPD. And this was already the case at the beginning of the process of cumulative radicalization of the AfD. Came 2014, a year of street protests in Germany. And those protests showed an openness to adopt elements of far-right ideologies and accept adherents of this movement to participate in a way which was not seen in previous years. Systematically searching for new audiences and fields of action, activists of the far-right, including neo-Nazis, attended different events and campaigns. Even the annual Al-Quds parade in Berlin in 2014, but there was seemingly no hope for an open participation of neo-Nazis at this event. But at other events in spring 2014, you may remember horrible scenes of anti-Jewish harassment and violence at marches and rallies around the Gaza conflict. There was a little more resonance. Far-right actors, however, have not been able to dominate them. But I like to show you an interesting example. Now I have to share the screen again, and I hope this time it will work a little bit better. Just a second. Okay. Okay. This is a march in 2014 as part of the protests around the Gaza conflict in that year. And this is a young man in a group. He's of an Arab background, and he's in a group of adherents of Al-Fatah. With a black and white keffiyeh and the Arafat poster, you can see it was this group was very aggressive at this event and how they behaved. And then this picture was put online. And what you can see on his arm, on his bare arm, he showed here, are clear neo-Nazi symbols, different neo-Nazi symbols. You cannot read the line which is tattooed on his skin here, the sentence which is tattooed here. It is from a white power song, a German white power song, in which the total extermination of Israel, the total destruction of Israel by atomic bombs is part of the fantasy, of the anti-Semitic fantasy. And this particular line reads, and this is interesting, I try to translate it ad hoc from German. I start with a German quote. Das tapfere palästinensische Volk sollte man ehren, weil sie als einzige auf der Welt sich noch gegen den Juden wehren. The brave Palestinian people should be honored because they are the only ones on the world who are still defend or still resist the Jew globally. That's this line. The song is banned in Germany. However, it is an interesting aspect of our problem because it shows again. That anti-Semitic neo-Nazi propaganda has a wider impact. It is not only shared by neo-Nazis. It has a wider impact, and here even an impact to a radicalized young man with an Arab Palestinian or supposedly Palestinian background. I don't know more about this man, which can just find on the internet images of this group he's active in, and on that occasion, and I think this is quite interesting. But let's get back to the demonstrations and marches where the political right was more successful to infiltrate or to become part of. All those campaigns, or some of those campaigns, started or reached the first peak in the year of 2014. For example, marches for life against abortion and large manifestations of the anti-gender movement took place with the participation of far-right circles. Another important form of protest started off with the invasion and occupation of the Crimea by Russia. Presented as Friedensmahnwachen, pickets for peace, and as a new peace movement, they attracted indeed some long-standing peace activists from the political left, however, not as prominent persons as the people who gathered in Berlin this weekend. But the most leftist groupings did not participate in those marches. They were built up of other people and many individuals who had rather been radicalized in their political opinions on new social media. They were not part of a left milieu or left-wing milieu, but they read in social media about who's behind this bloody wars, and then of course it's George Soros and so on. You can figure it out. However, the decisive breakthrough came with the beginning of mass protests against refugees. In 2014, the first manifestations against local placements of refugees had been organized by and large by activists of the NPD, but not under their own banner. They achieved support from a broader public, first on the local level. Under the impression of the advance of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, as well as a wave of brutal terrorist attacks in Europe, street mobilizations began. Other street mobilizations began, and those were A, not focused anymore on a local problem or audience, like the NPD demonstrations. They were openly far-right activists as organizers have not been visible and sometimes, in fact, not even involved. And C, the organizers tried to avoid open far-right propaganda and were successful in camouflaging their campaigns as actions of besorgte Bürger, concerned citizens. The most prominent example is a long-lasting Dresden-based campaign of weekly marches under the name of Pegida, Patriotic Europeans Against an Islamization of the Abendland. And Abendland is the term I cannot translate to a language like English. This is a very German term. Exploiting the understandable public fear about an aggressive, violent political Islam, the movement attracted many citizens who were not yet, or at least not yet, leaning to the far right. Amongst those, some Jewish individuals and supporters of Israel were to be found. An Israeli flag was raised each week by some participants of the weekly Pegida marches in Dresden. Not officially, that is, but it is noteworthy that neither the organizers nor the militant hooligan and neo-Nazi mob, which was formative for the movement, tried to attack the group. The heated atmosphere of the street protests contributed to the fast radicalization of the AfD from the beginning of 2015 on. To a certain point, this process can be described as a step-by-step takeover of the young party by far-right activists. Some of them had a long personal history in the far-right and even neo-Nazi scene. For example, the chairman of the party's branch in the federal state of Brandenburg, Andreas Kalbitz. According to eyewitness reports, he had personally spread propaganda for Holocaust denial in the 1990s. So this is not proof, but it's quite likely to be. Kalbitz's colleague in Thuringia, now one of the strongest men in the AfD, Björn Höcke, had also long-standing relations to the NPD and the far-right milieu. In the AfD, Höcke started his career as a main personality on the far-right wing with anti-Semitic speeches. Especially his speech in January 2017 in Dresden is remarkable. Embedded in a robust anti-Semitic and National Socialist ideology, he called the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin a Mahnmal der Schande, a monument of dishonor. Other examples from the AfD, from all levels, from the top to the rank and file and ordinary returns, could easily be given. However, some in the AfD tried to avoid this image of a radicalized far-right and anti-Semitic party. Those are by no means democratic or moderate politicians, but they had another strategy or tactic and they pursued. One of the tactical measures by members of the federal board was the formation of a group, Juden in der AfD, Jews in the AfD, or JAfD, in 2018. Pretty soon after this media scoop, and it was a media scoop in fact, pretty soon after this media scoop, it became clear to the public that the group consisted of only 24 members. Amongst this little group, some with quite obscure relations to Judaism. However, from the more radical part of the new right, grouped around organizations like the Institut für Staatspolitik, the Jews in the AfD have been attacked in aggressive articles and postings, especially for their support of Israel. The anti-Semitic motivation behind this attacks was obvious. Members of the JAfD are by now totally frustrated with the party, and the group seems to be more or less inactive. In an in-depth analysis of its activities, I've been able to prove that JAfD itself used anti-Semitic stereotypes and thus intensified the prejudices and hatred against Jews within its AfD audience. Since almost all Jewish institutions, religious and secular, and pro-Israeli lobby groups dismissed the claim of JAfD to be an authentic Jewish voice and warned against the AfD in a public statement, the group called for a boycott of all organizations signed. That would have meant a boycott of the most important Zionist organizations and fundraisers for Israel, including the German branches of WISO, the Zionist Youth, Maccabi, and even the Karen Kayemet and Kevin Hayesot. In the Bundestag, the federal parliament, the AfD supports regularly some of the political demands of pro-Israel lobby groups. And this intelligent tactical move is mainly aimed to attack the government and is thus part of the fundamental opposition strategy of the AfD. In all other fields, the AfD rather fuels the hate and prejudices against Jews in Germany. Allied with the party and with the street campaigns is a vivid spectrum of media services. Amongst them are many new projects, partly 100% internet-based, some very do-it-yourself-like, others more professional, but also new printed periodicals, which popped up like mushrooms in the years after 2015. The larger and more commercialized ones introduced also video channels and podcasts to bypass the public law broadcasters in Germany. Some magazines ceased after a few issues, others continue to be published, some expanded. One of the most important is the glossy magazine Compact, with its publisher, the former Maoist activist Jürgen Elsässer. Some suspect him to be an operative of the Russians and Compact to be a hidden proxy of the Kremlin. May that be or not, it is interesting that Elsässer, in his magazine, is almost always in line with the Kremlin's political interests. The content of Compact has becoming more and more openly anti-Semitic. I will spare the examples, but they are quite interesting also in what they are writing about in Compact. And it has impact. It has a wide reach. You can buy it on some railway station, newspaper shops, and so on. This new far-right movement developed in the shadow of the European refugee crisis of 2015-2016, or what was called here in Germany refugee crisis. Personally, I don't really like the word because I think it's not accurate. Why was the campaign against refugees and immigration so important for the formation of this new far-right movement? It functioned well to pick up your everyday xenophobia, the fear of change connected with immigration. The far-right was able to use the xenophobic unease to influence the audience with its own more radical ideologies. Latent or manifest forms of anti-Jewish resentment helped to radicalize the movement substantially. This can best be shown when analyzing the myth of a great replacement. Like in all political conspiracy theories, the problem of immigration is pictured only as an outward symptom with a big secret behind it. The foreigners do, in that narrative, not belong here, but if they stay home, they are not a problem. For anti-Semites, it is a secret hidden elite which is interested in mass immigration. They are the real enemies, not the foreigners in that worldview. Why? The main reason is, according to this narrative, to destroy the identity of the German people. In a biological sense, this is the idea of replacement in itself. Replacement not by another people, but by a blend or mixture of different peoples. But there's also a mental aspect. According to this paranoia, the cultural identity shall also be destroyed. Therefore, the Holocaust cult seems to be necessary. This new aggression against the German and other European people is, according to the anti-Semites, only part of a long history of anti-German warfare. Höcke, for example, believes that the destruction of Germany's cultural heritage was a main aim of the Allied strategic bombings in World War II, to break the identity, to break the physical health, the psychological health of the German people, and to make them feel guilty. But who is responsible for this aggression? According to the propaganda, globalized anti-German elites. Sometimes they are openly named as the Jews, and you would be astonished how open that is possible in Germany to blame the Jews. Sometimes prominent individuals like George Soros are highlighted with their Jewish background, either mentioned or just indicated by coded messages. And sometimes, like in texts of the identitarian Martin Sellner from Austria, I've mentioned him before, or by Alexander Gauland, then the chairman of the AfD. Sometimes the attributes given to those replacers or globalized elites and their allies are identical with themes from the Jewish conspiracy myth and other anti-Semitic narratives. You can easily decode those attributes. As you see, I'm running out of time, and I will not be able to introduce other examples, which might have been very interesting. It would have been very important to bring in gender perspectives here. With the destruction of German manliness and virility by feminists, gender mainstreaming, and so on, as another anti-Semitic myth, as you can figure, all those negative, in the eyes of the right-wingers, negative developments are planned by an evil Jewish conspiracy. That you can find that, for example, in the last prominent speech of Björn Höcke on the 3rd of October last year. Quite an interesting, very sound, very solid anti-Semitic, very solid anti-Semitic speech about Russia, about a Rainbow International which tries to destroy humanity and so on. But I don't have the time here. However, narratives and myths like this reached the young, socially isolated video gamer Stefan Baljet in Halle, strengthened his misogynist, masculinist, xenophobic, racist worldview. All different elements had been integrated by the great denominator of far-right ideology. And this great denominator of far-right ideology is, at least that's my analysis, anti-Semitism. He saw Jews as being responsible for those negative developments. So he invested a lot of his private time for preparation of weapons for mass murder before attacking the synagogue. He really was eager to build weapons to kill Jews. It was, in fact, a horrible crime with 2 persons killed, but he did not get access to the synagogue, and only because he's such an idiot, only this prevented him from killing much more people, and in that case, a lot of Jewish people. Nobody can guarantee that the next Jew hater from the far right is as stupid as Baljet. I will not end this lecture with the story of Halle, which you may be familiar with, but with another shocking event which is not as prominent. At the peak of COVID-related protests, an activist of that movement in the federal state of Brandenburg, close to Berlin, a man who was not known to be a right-winger before, but has, we can prove, has read a lot of far-right online content recently. This man killed his 3 minor daughters. He killed his wife and then committed suicide. It was a shocking event. And we tried to find out more about it because we knew that he was in the scene. No, I have a problem because unfortunately the state prosecutor disallows me access to the confession and suicide letter. While the state prosecutor publicly denies any anti-Semitic motives for this killing of a whole family, the police authorities read the letter differently, pointing out to the idea in this letter that an evil conspiracy is going on, And the man has killed his kids because he feared that they will be taken away from him. In order to feed, I don't know. I've not been able to read this this letter. But if the police is right and the state prosecutor is wrong, which I cannot decide without knowledge of the letter, if this is a fact, this is another extreme example of the dangerous, even murderous impact of far-right anti-Semitism. Why do I end with this event? One of the reasons is that I think we, especially the Jews amongst us, that we should be aware of an impact of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic violence to people who are not part of the Jewish community. Anti-Semitism is not only dangerous for Jews, it is dangerous for Jews in the first place, of course. But it is also dangerous for the broader society because it's such a projection which can lead to events like the killing in Senzig, close to Berlin, I just mentioned. And even if it's not the case in this case, then we have other examples where we can show that these anti-Semitic fantasies are really very, very dangerous. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm really looking forward to answer your questions because I had to skip a lot of interesting aspects here. And now I will give back the word to the microphone to Günter Jekeli. Thank you.